Hey everyone, in this video, I'm gonna make a Quillian Dagger. I'll use another piece of the Damascus from the sword, and then what I'll do is forge it to shape, that way I can keep as much of the material as possible. So the first thing that I want to do is forge the bevels back into the billet. Right now the edges are really thin from when someone tried to grind bevels into the sword, so I'll be real careful not to let those edges roll over. Once I have the same thickness across the whole billet, I'll use the guillotine tool and mark where the tang will start. And then I can just forge this material down to match the depth of those marks. I'll go back to the guillotine and set the marks a little deeper, and then keep forging the material to match the depth of the marks. Once you do that a couple times, it really thickens the tang up quite a bit, so then you can switch to the cross-peen hammer and really start to draw that material out. Once I have the length that I need on the tang, I'll straighten everything up and remove all the marks from drawing out the material. I'm done with the tang, so I'll switch to the blade side and start to forge that material into the profile of the blade. I'm done forging the blade to the shape that I like, so I'm going to let it anneal in the forge overnight. I'm going to do the surface grinding with the contact wheel on the belt grinder. I'll get it as flat as I can with the contact wheel. And once I get it as flat as I can with the contact wheel, I'll spray some tool ink layout fluid on here. That way I can mark the center and the profile of the blade. I'll use the flatten and grind up to my scribe lines to grind out the profile of the blade. I'll use my 4x36 grinder to get it as flat as possible. I don't have a surface grinder, so this is the best I can do to make it flat. I'll use a drill bit the same thickness as the blade and then clamp it to a piece of marble. And then I'll run the tip of the drill bit along the edge of the blade to mark the center. I don't have a height gauge, but this works pretty good. Once I have all my scribe lines in place, I'll go ahead and use my file jig and file in the punch lines before I go to the grinder. Once I have my punch lines in place, I'll switch to the belt grinder and grind in the bevels. I'll leave the blade a little bit thick, that way when I go to do the heat treat, I don't have to worry about warping or cracking as much. I'll do a couple thermal cycles before I quench the blade. I'll heat the blade up to about 1650 degrees for 10 minutes and then let that cool down in the vermiculite. Then I'll do it again at 1550 degrees and one more time at 1450 degrees. I'm using Parks 50 quench oil, so I'll make sure to preheat the oil to 120 degrees. I quenched the blade at 1550 degrees. Now I did notice that it picked up a warp across the whole blade, so I take it straight to the vise and let it cool down completely in the vise, and that did seem to help quite a bit. It does still seem to have a little bit of a warp in the tang, but I can fix that with the torch, and then if there's any warp left in the blade, I left it thick enough that I can grind it out. I'll temper the blade at 400 degrees for about an hour and then hand sand the surface to 1000 grit. I etched the Damascus in the ferric chloride. It's 4 parts distilled water to 1 part ferric chloride. I'll let that etch for 10 minutes. Alright, so now that the blade is finished, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the hilt. For the guard, I'm going to use this piece of round brass, and I'll just turn the left and right arms of the guard in the lathe, and then I'll mill the flat sections. Once I'm done turning the left and right arms of the guard, I'll go ahead and chuck it up in the mill and then mill one side flat. Now when I flip it over, I can mill the opposite side parallel with the first cut. Once I have both sides cut, I can squeeze that in the vise and get a perfect 90-degree cut from those two cuts. And then I'll just flip it one last time for the final cut. I'll switch my end mill to an 1/8 inch end mill and mill a slot for the tang. I'll drill 3 separate holes and then mill out the material between the holes. It always seems to work a lot easier that way. And then I'll cut a little relief for the ricasso. I chuck it back up in the lathe so I can round out the rings where I cut into them a little bit with the mill. And then I'll just cut out the material at the end of each arm. Now I'm ready to work on the spacers and the pommel. I don't have a big enough piece of brass for that, so I'll melt some brass to make my own brass bar. I'll use some cutoff pieces and I'll use some scrap pieces from previous projects that I've been saving up, and then I'll melt them in my crucible and then pour it into a mold that I made with the Petrobond sand. I used a piece of 3/4 inch mild steel round bar and then packed the Petrobond sand around that. So obviously I didn't do a very good job of packing the sand down towards the bottom, so there was kind of a void there where some of the brass went into, but that's no big deal. I got plenty of material here to do what I need to do. Now I'm gonna mark where I want to put the top spacer, the center spacer, and the pommel. That way I can turn all 3 pieces at once. I'll start with the top spacer first, then the pommel. The space between the pommel and the top spacer will automatically become the center spacer. And now I'll mill a slot for the tang in both of the spacers. I mark where I want the threads on the end of the tang, and then I'll grind right up to my scribe line. Once I have my square, I'll cut 45-degree bevels on all 4 corners, and then I'll round everything over with a higher grit belt. I use a 440 die and thread the tang. I use the lathe to drill a hole in the center of the pommel, and then I'll tap the hole with a 440 tap. For my handle material, I'm using a White Pearl acrylic pen blank. Since this dagger is so small, a pen blank is the perfect size handle material. All I'm doing is turning it into a perfect cylinder with a little bit of a bevel on each end, and then I'll mill slots for the tang. And now I'm ready to polish all the pieces and put it together. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll get back to you. And if you like this video, please click the like button and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.